We know without a shadow of a doubt, we know it's been proven, it's clearly a fact that higher degrees of unionization lead to lower inequality in a society.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
This is Propa-Ganada.
Welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, if you're like me, you take for granted things like having the 40-hour work week or getting paid overtime if you work beyond that, having the weekends off, not having young children running around the workplace as child slaves, not having live electrical wires and slippery floors that pose a health risk. And because our workplaces are free from these things is largely due to the union movement and collective bargaining. So today's interview is with Professor Judy Fudge. And much like Fudge, Judy has a lot of really important information to bring into our brains. She is a highly decorated scholar, lawyer, and activist in the field of labor law, as well as the intersections with feminism, migrant workers, and the precarious workforce. And in our interview today, we touch on a lot of different areas in this overall topic. Please enjoy. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your approach to law and studying law with this kind of integration in sociology.
No, I went to law school after I had done a BA and a master's, and I was thinking that I would go into a PhD in philosophy. But I wanted something more practical, I guess, or dealt with power more directly. I was in the violence against women's movement. So I went to law school, and it made no sense to me at all, except for one course. And that person always kept saying, look who's involved in these big cases. Who's paying for this? How does this work over time? Do you see patterns? And I realized that if you only looked at the facts and the cases in front of you, you missed the patterns. So to really see how law operates with power, you have to kind of understand what social forces are important. So I turned to a kind of socio-legal approach because I couldn't understand the law just on its own terms. It was incoherent.
So can you go into a bit more detail about, so what's some of the context that comes up when you start looking at the social side of things?
Okay, so if you're learning about tort law, so we don't have a general accident insurance program. In New Zealand, if you're injured or harmed in any way, you go and get compensated like workers' compensation. Here, it depends on having someone with insurance, having their insurance company pay for it. And so when you look at tort law, so ours is all private litigation, and you look at all of these cases, and you can only be compensated if someone's at fault, if someone didn't shovel their driveway, if someone didn't check over their shoulder. And you see that there's all this dispute going on, and you uncover it. And it's not the person who's paid for insurance who is disputing it. It's the insurance company, but their name isn't even on the case. And you're not even allowed to mention that there's insurance because it's the doctrine of subrogation. So you think it's one little person suing another little person. And in fact, it's a big corporation typically suing another big corporation. And they talk about how fair this system is. Yet we pay a lot of money and we waste a lot of money. And it's all hidden because you're not allowed to mention it in court.
In capitalism, there's always this perennial struggle for labor to unionize. Why is unionization important?
Well, I think you can look at it in terms of its outcomes. We know, without a shadow of a doubt, we know it's been proven, it's clearly a fact that higher degrees of unionization lead to lower inequality in a society. It's just absolutely clear. If there's lower inequality in society, the people who are at the very bottom do better off in that kind of society. If there's high inequality, people at the very bottom do very poorly, and the people at the top do very, very well. And unions are one of the highest ways that we can reduce inequality because they redistribute. So if we're concerned about inequality, we think people should have access to the kind of life they think is valuable to choose, then we should be supporting instruments we know alleviate it. So that's just consequential. Also, the other thing about unions, you think of it, it's not Jeff Bezos that Amazon workers have to deal with. Jeff by himself, who knows what kind of guy he is. It's the fact he's a series of relations over capital flows and over copyright, intellectual property, and that's all collective. Jeff is an individual, but a corporation is a series of collective relations. So capital is by definition collective, but it hides behind this notion that it's just one person. Unions are not collections of capital, they're collections of human beings. So we can't hide. So I think just to be fair, it seems fair that if one group gets to organize and use their collective muscle, the other groups should be able to.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, organizing people to counteract organized money, I guess. Eh?
Yeah, absolutely. And then for a third reason, we spend a huge amount of time working, right? And one of the things that when I used to teach labor law, you tell people you leave your civil liberties outside the workplace. The employer has the right to tell you how to dress, what badges to wear, as long as they don't interfere with your human rights, right? Well, I don't know. I think in universities and in workplaces, and generally speaking, giving people a say, that's what we call democracy, is a good thing. So yeah. Unions are consequentially good for inequality. They're conceptually and politically fairer. And thirdly, they're more democratic than most other institutions.
Mm. And I'm curious, just from your things that you've learned, any kind of interesting points about the history of the union movement in Canada?
Yeah, I think that when people come together is when they feel that there's a blatant injustice and when they have some power, so they think they can right it. So think of the wartime. Canada was very patriotic, but in 1943, the steel industry went on strike during the war. 1 in 3 working people was on strike in 1943 because there were wage and price controls, but not really price controls. And all of these armament manufacturers and manufacturers were getting cost plus, but workers were being treated unfairly. So as a result, people went out on strike, and that's how we had the labor protections that we still have. We've still got 1944 labor law protections in a 21st century economy. So that's an example. Another example would be in the mid-60s, when we see the expansion of the public sector at the local level, at the provincial level, at the federal level, and postal workers and other public sector workers said, no, we should be able to unionize as well as people in a for-profit plant. So we saw a big wave of unionization there. So we see these examples. Often they come because people feel unfairness. Things are being taken away from them, protections. But they also have to think that they have a chance of winning.
I find it interesting idea that the process of unionization is one of the best ways for people of different races, genders, orientations who historically have been at odds or have been caused to be fragmented, have been divided and conquered, how the process of unionization is a really effective way to getting people to realize who the real opponent is. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk to that. Maybe you can talk about like the effect of unionization on women in the workforce as they started coming into the workforce.
Yeah, unions are in a difficult position, right? Because one of the things that they do is they can control the labor process. So they have skills so that they can stop working and the employer can't do the stuff. And that's skilled work, highly technical work. And those things are increasingly easy to replace, right, with new technologies. The other kind of power that workers have is controlling the labor supply. So unions have had sometimes tried to exclude people, and we have to acknowledge that. There was a history of exclusion of Chinese workers, Italian workers, women workers. But unions included at the same time. So the industrial workers of the world always included workers of different races and ethnicities. The early Confederation of Canadian Unions that emerged in the 70s specifically targeted women and racialized workers. So once we started seeing that, in fact, keeping people out wasn't a successful strategy, unions actually tried to bring people in. And unionization has been the key way that women workers made gains in the 60s and 70s. And then into the 80s and 90s. So right now in Canada, unionization is mostly in the public sector. Over 70% of public sector workers at all levels of government are unionized, and the broader public sector. But under 17% of the private sector is unionized. And if you look who's unionized in the public sector, women dominate, people who are educated, people who are a bit older. So unions have really helped women get ahead. And men's wages have polarized. People up at the top, bankers, people like that, right? Manufacturing workers have lost their jobs. So men's wages have declined. So partially we can see this is that women are getting public sector jobs that are unionized, and men are have been losing their unionized jobs. So we see this declining gender gap, but it hasn't got much to do with really women getting so much better on top of men, but women not falling behind, and men have. And that's because women have managed to keep unionized jobs.
What are some of the factors that have caused this decline in union membership over the last few decades, in your view?
The key really is the change in the economy. It was so crucial. Having lived through it, I was in law school in the early 1980s when this changed. What we saw was a profound shift in all the advanced industrialized capitalist countries, from manufacturing to service sector. And it was a profound restructuring. It's at the same time we saw the movement to increase profitability, the financialization of capital so that you're making money more on speculative, on building things, outsourcing, and of course, free trade agreements. This restructuring was a kind of entree to free trade and industrial restructuring. So we have labor laws that were designed for mass manufacturing and big resource extraction in the 1940s, worked well in the 50s, worked pretty well in the 60s, started fraying in the 70s, fell apart. So it doesn't work for temporary work. It doesn't work for small retail. We always knew that. It doesn't work for big finance, try and organize bank tellers. So it's just not fit for purpose. So you don't have to do much. You can tinker at the edges to make it nastier for unions, which all governments have done, who are conservative. But you don't even have to do that. It just doesn't fit anymore. It doesn't work in this kind of workplace. You see, the thing is, if I'm a union organizer, I know that I am going to be facing opposition, that I have to hold a secret organizing drive, then get 50% of everyone to sign a card. Then the employer is going to challenge whether they're employees or they're independent contractors, whether they're doing confidential work. So I'm going to spend tens of thousands of dollars doing this. So I can't afford to do it unless the workplace has a certain size of employees. Where people aren't going into workplaces, are they? Right? People are doing work through platforms, right? People are being hired through employment agencies. So I get cards, I organize this warehouse, I go, yay. And then the warehouse says, they're not my employees. The temporary employment agency is their employer. So delay. And one thing that works in labor law to defeat unionization is delay, 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 delay. So that's how I can do it. I just have to object. I can be like Donald Trump. I object. Throw it out. I object. Throw it out. Those are all expenses I can write off.
I've seen articles in the past that clearly have an anti-union slant, and I think maybe people coming up into the workforce might see this stuff and it might kind of give them pause about the benefits of unionization. I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
It's really, people think of unions as foreign agents in the workplace. Really, very few of my students are unionized. Very few of my students have parents who are unionized. Really, even in a labor studies program, like, yeah, when I was teaching in law schools, I could understand that. Labor studies, maybe 20% of parents, 30, but so we're not talking about unions being generally understood. Only the union density is 32%, right? So people have no sense of them. And if you think that the whole thing is about individual freedom and individual choice, and you can do it all your own, and having to go through the union or waiting for the union, it just seems wrong. So we have no sense of them. There's not, great TV shows about union organizers going from workplace to workplace, organizing, gig workers or garment workers or dyeing meat packing workers. We don't have anything like that. We think of unions as something quaint from the past, and we've forgotten how significant they have been. And when they're confined to the public sector, and what mostly doing and administering a collective agreement, you tend to think of them just as another part of human resources.
Compared to hypothetical jobs, all else being held equivalent, one is in a unionized position and one is not. What are some of the extra protections and rights and pension or benefits that one could expect from the unionized?
Okay, so let's say that you're terminated without notice. The employer says you were insubordinate. You were willfully disobedient in a way that I cannot accept, or you're totally incompetent. I can bring an employment standards claim, which would get me 2 weeks pay for every year I worked, up to a maximum of 8 weeks. Right? I could do that. I could bring a legal claim, common law action, which is going to cost me $20,000 in small claims court with a cap, or up to $50,000 when all of the burden is on me to bring the expenses, and then the employer has to show a good reason. Or I'm unionized, and I go to my union and I go, hey, this is what they did. And the union goes, okay. They have to follow the process, and we have a duty to represent you. That's one really tangible thing at an individual level. We also know that environments that are unionized have less health and safety accidents. We know that, right? So there's a whole range of things that have to do with the enforcement of laws, the actual terms and conditions, the kinds of protections that you get that are really helpful for people. And, it's like love. You never think it's going to go bad until it does, right? You never think about, the breakup part. That's kind of like work. You never think about what's going to happen if I need to renegotiate my work schedule because my elderly mom has dementia and I can't take certain shifts, right? I'm not feeling really confident at that time. It'd be really nice to have a union to help me out, right? So those are really tangible things, I think.
And now kind of moving more towards the immigration side of things,
Mm-hmm.
You've done a lot of, I've seen a few of your talks about the kind of two-tiered level of immigration we have.
We want to have immigrants, right? And we've always wanted immigrants in Canada, always. At a certain point in time, we had a white-only immigration policy until the mid-60s. Ellen Fairclough, a Conservative MP who represented Hamilton, got rid of the white Canada immigration clause in the mid-60s. So we stopped being racist, but what we decided was we want the smartest, the brightest, the best, right? And we recognize their skills and we give them better conditions. They can bring their families. They can come permanent residents. The people who we think aren't so skilled, but we absolutely need to care for our kids, to care for our elderly, to grow our food, to cut our meat in meat packing plants, to actually do all the fish processing. Those people, we don't value their skills enough to let them live here. But we want them to work here, so we let them come in, but we don't let them bring their family members. We don't let them become permanent residents. We say, you guys, you're good enough to work, but you can't stay. The other ones with the high qualifications, hey, you're good enough to work and you're good enough to stay. So you see who doesn't get in. So people from Mexico and the Caribbean who come to grow our crops, they don't get to live permanently. Caregivers don't get to live permanently either. So you have this kind of two-tier system. It would be kind of like having kids. And you have certain of your kids, you go, okay, you didn't do that well at school. You didn't work that hard on the right things. You know, you're charming, but, you know, and you do really important things around the house, but, you know, you're not quite as good. So you can't marry. You don't get to live in the big house. You get to stay over here. But, you know, the kids we really love, the smart ones, the really good ones, yeah, you can stay on. Yeah, we'll help you guys out. So it's just not a good thing to say that people's contributions are only about things like that. Because then if we say that about foreigners, then we may say it about, oh, well, you know, they're in nursing homes. They're not like young, dynamic people. You just don't want to get the taste of treating people so significantly differently on the basis that even though they make a contribution, you just don't think it's worth that much.
And can you talk a little bit about so let's say an agricultural or domestic workers that are coming for these shorter contracts. I understand that oftentimes they're tied to an employer. Is that still the case, or has that changed?
No, that's still the case, and that's also the case with most high wage worker. We don't call it high skill and low skill anymore. We call it high wage and low wage. So almost everyone is on a closed visa, a closed work permit. You know, when I was a professor in the UK, I couldn't change employers, but it was unlikely that my university was going to force me to live in a crowded bunkhouse, right? Whereas if I am a farm worker, I haven't got the language skills, I don't have the social capital, I don't have the option to become a permanent resident because our seasonal agricultural workers program not only ties my residence and my work to that employer, I can't become a permanent resident and they can have me repatriated. Under the seasonal agricultural workers program. A farmer can phone up that Caribbean country visa officer or the Mexican visa officer and say, I don't want that one, and send them back. Or they can say, you know, next year, I don't want that one either. So that's pretty unilateral, right?
And what about, can you talk about the agencies that take a fee to the placement agencies?
Yeah, it's illegal in Canada in every jurisdiction for a recruitment agency to charge workers for placement services. Despite that, we know the whole sector is riddled with these unlawful agencies that charge between $2,000 and $15,000 to get a job at a McDonald's or to be a live-in caregiver in someone's home or to get a job at a meat packing firm. So we know this. We say it's illegal and then we did nothing because we said, oh, it's a problem over there. It's not a problem here. It's those bad people in their country. Well, we actually discovered it was both. Excuse me. So now what we've done is we've put in place regulations, initially in Manitoba, then Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and now BC, that quite tightly regulate the problem of illegal fees. So that's quite good. Ontario, we don't have it.
And can you talk about the unionization rate of these temporary foreign workers? And can you talk about how it affects local labor markets, even though I hate that term?
Yeah, part of the problem with the whole issue around temporary foreign workers is we bring them in to areas where we say Canadians won't work. So that would be agriculture, that's meat processing. No, lots of Canadians used to work in meat processing, and they were initially immigrants, and then they became really good jobs because they unionized. The Meat Packers Union then turned into the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and it was highly unionized in one big pattern across the country. Good terms and conditions, great terms and conditions. But in the mid-'80s, the Canadian meat packers, as red meat consumption declined, said, we're going to break the pattern. We're going to increase competition. And they took the union to court, and the labor board said they had to go back to bargaining place by place by place, which is inefficient and costly. Then large firms like J&B and Tyson consolidated meat packing and really, really increased the labor process, the speed of the labor process, and broke unions. They started then substituting permanent residents with temporary workers. However, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union in Manitoba, Brandon actually, started organizing these workers and started getting routes to permanent citizenship for these workers through its collective agreement. Okay, so we could either see temporary foreign workers as a cheap labor strategy and we keep them out. Or we can see employers will always employ a cheap labor strategy. How do we build the capacity to bring people in and bring them up? And we saw what happens in situations where we don't organize and protect. At meatpacking in Alberta, there was huge outbreaks, right? Even with the union, right?
Interesting. And do these temporary foreign workers, I imagine they pay taxes. What rights do they have in terms of voting and healthcare benefits and that kind of thing? Or is there a variety?
Again, that's Canada's mismatch. So immigration is mostly under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Labor law and access to health is provincial. So they're all covered by labor law. But if your employer can say, I can deport you if you're under the seasonal workers agreement, or if you think, oh, they will deport me, you may not complain. So that's one thing. Ontario is pretty good. It provides to documented workers health care immediately to temporary foreign workers. BC, people have to wait 3 months. The problem is whether you can access it. So if you're living on the employer's property in a bunkhouse, accessing medical services is really difficult. Also, if it's work related, that means the workers' insurance, workers' safety and insurance board rates could go up. So the real problem is that even if you give these workers rights, it's really hard to protect them and to enforce them.
Can you talk a little bit about the gig economy and Uber drivers, Lyft drivers? There was, the recent Proposition 22 in California that was voted down, unfortunately. But I was wondering if you could maybe give me an update about what the situation is like with those type of workers here in Canada.
Everyone's concerned about what's going to happen with platform-mediated work, right? And Uber is a form of platform-mediated work where the workers have to be in a specific locale. So they're clearly undercutting people who were otherwise in more regulated work, right? So that's absolutely clear. And we know what Uber does. It moves in, it gets a lot of drivers, and then it lowers and lowers and lowers and lowers and lowers their payment. Okay, but for some people, not a huge amount, but a proportion of them, it truly is a secondary gig for them. They're doing it for consumption, debt payment, who knows why. For others, it's their primary form of work. That's, without it, they don't have access to, in the US, health care, in Canada pension plan contributions, a whole range of payroll kind of benefits, right? So people are differently situated about it. And again, you typically don't worry about these things until something bad happens. Then you think about them, right? So in the US and California, the legislatures had developed a test of who's an employee, so who is actually really working for someone else and not controlling their profit, to someone who is working in a business of their own account and truly controls. They developed a test which swept in Uber drivers. Well, California is the home of Uber, Lyft, and then there's Mechanical Turk, where you have platforms and people do work all over the world. Crowdflower, right? Oh my God, that's the business model of outsourcing. Oh my God, what if they're all employees? Next thing, what are we going to have? Global social insurance? Oh, my dream becomes someone else's nightmare. So you can whip up a lot about freedom. Look, really? Being told to wear a mask somehow offends people's deepest dignity. So the freedom not to be called an employee and not to be paid the minimum wage was sold under Proposition 22 as a way of maintaining a vibrant, big market for these things. So that was a real setback. But it was driven by, over $200 million worth of payments around that these companies paid. But it was a setback, and it was a democratic setback. In Canada, the Supreme Court struck down Uber's attempt to say that you'd have to go to private arbitration to claim that you were an employee. and you couldn't get access to justice through the Ontario Employment Standards branch like other people. Now Uber has changed its arbitration clause, and it says, no, our clause will work. You know, I like to see legal victories. I think they're very important, but it's easy to relitigate. It slows things down. So it's a huge controversy. It's been a problem we've known about for years, right? Because all gig work is super casual work. And that's the way most work was before the Second World War. That's why we got unions and collective agreements and standard employment, was because people don't do well if they don't have a secure source of income. They can't buy a house. They can't get a car loan. They can't have kids. So Wayne Luchuk in the Southern Ontario precarious employment study discovered that even people with professional degrees were postponing major life choices because they might have a decent paid job, but it's so casual and freelance and giggy, right? Well, it's not so good if, you know, the people we like the best, we want to become our permanent residents, our own, you know, Canadians, aren't having kids, right? So then we have to bring in, you know, low paid people and then send them back to their countries. Doesn't make sense, does it?
No. Did you have any observations on when in the universities that you've worked at the way that teaching assistants and PhD students and graduate students seem to be taking a bit more of the burden, and a lot of times because they're contract work, they're not as unionized? Or
basically what happens is for people who are in their first 4 years of their graduate degrees, their PhDs, they're only allowed to do a certain amount of paid work through the university, right? So it's clear that teaching assistants, or where worse exploitation is happening, is people who have their PhDs and who are cobbling together a livelihood. Each course pays them $6,000 to $7,000. So they have to cobble together quite a lot, right? And often at different universities, right? And often at the last minute to have a livable wage. So for those people, it really is a bad situation. They're lucky to get a year contract, and they can't get out of it because they're spending too much time teaching, okay? So they are really in a horrible situation. Our graduate students, they're also working hard. They have to do that at the same time as they're doing their studies, but there's many more regulations. And it's completely clear. I've been in the university system as a full-time tenured track faculty member for 32 years. We work a lot harder than we used to. We just, you know, all of my lectures that I post have to be captioned. I build websites. I do a whole range of things. When I have syllabi, I didn't have course outlines when I went to university, right? So those things have all changed a huge amount just in terms of the sheer amount of administrative work. I have not had anyone print a letter or put it on letterhead for 20 years, but when I started at a law school, there were 3 people to 1 secretary, as she was called, right?
Yeah.
So there's an increase in work for everyone and a shrinking of the number of good jobs, because even though my work has become much more administrative and repetitious, I've still got a really good job, great job. But there's lots of people who won't get great jobs because there's just not enough.
Right. I was wondering if you could comment on solidarity between unions in Canada. I know that's some of the what makes unions so strong is when they take actions in solidarity with others. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about if that solidarity has been growing or how it's been shifting over the last few decades.
Yeah, union solidarity is a really interesting thing because you have to look at kind of the history and the kind of collective bargaining legislation that we have. So our union movement was a kind of mix of British unions a bit, then clearly dominated by American unions because most of our unions were from the US, but then with a distinctive Quebecois French union. So we've always had different elements, right? So because of the composition of the country, the shift from alignment with Britain to alignment with the United States, and the distinctiveness of Quebec. We have also been modeled on the American system of collective bargaining, which is workplace by workplace, and it's called industrial pluralist. And the thing about that is you have a secret unionizing drive, and the union to get the majority of the cards wins. So unions in Canada compete against each other for the same groups of workers. If you look at a country like Sweden or Germany, unions don't bargain workplace by workplace, they bargain sectorally or nationally. They don't compete against each other. So we have a system where it's competitive unions for unions in the same sectors. So the Canadian Labour Congress makes sure that the unions don't fight, but the affiliates are stronger than the center. So sometimes that doesn't stop the fighting. So our solidarity tends to be more solidarity in support of picket lines, solidarity in support of common legislation, but it tends to be competitive unionism. And actually, our structure of unionism, which is based on the US structure, is a very weak form of unionism and quite easy to defeat and get people to fight. So the solidarity that occurs in Canada is remarkable because the institutions are designed to prevent it, not support it.
Fascinating. That's very interesting. So I guess the ideal situation would be all workers, everyone who sells their labor for money, is part of a big union, and then there's subcategories. That'd be the in capitalism.
Yeah, you have to think. So you'd have to think because you want to have solidarity, but you also don't want to have just the same rules, and that's right because people are differently situated. So how do you work that out? And you do want there to be some notion of alternative. So you do want things to be democratic. So we don't want democracy to be seen just as a competitive marketplace. That's how we look at it in Canada and the US, mostly the US. Okay. In Europe, you can see it as, okay, democracy is different groups of people coming together in different ways, working on coalitions, competing amongst values, but they're based on, different forms of representation. So I think I would agree with you, Jacob. I think that moving more towards a consolidation with ways of developing structures that represent disagreement would be a good way of going. And I hope it wouldn't be quite as polarized as Canadian federalism.
Yeah. Now, I guess I want to leave you with the last word. So I'm going to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. If you had one thing that you could, one tidbit you could share with the audience, or one thing that you wish more Canadians knew about or cared about, it could be anything. What would it be?
Ooh. I think it would be to look seriously at how the pandemic has clearly disclosed that the people who take the risks, who go on crowded subways, crowded buses, work in dangerous workplace, do things that are considered not that valuable, have been considered essential workers. Yet very little has changed. So I would think that would be my biggest tell. Clearly the pandemic has revealed that those who take the risks do not enjoy the rewards. And there's something profoundly, disturbingly unfair when it comes to the world of work.